I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office, that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria.
Before anything else can make sense in this case, there's one term that needs to be understood clearly, because without it, almost everything that follows falls apart. Drowning is what forensic pathologists call a diagnosis of exclusion. That phrase carries real weight. It means an examiner cannot simply look at a body pulled from water and write drowning as the cause of death. Water conceals almost everything. A person can genuinely drown, or a person can die from something else entirely and end up in the water afterward. And in a body that's been submerged for any significant length of time, those two very different scenarios can look almost identical to the eye. The only responsible path to a drowning conclusion is to work backward first. Rule out head trauma. Rule out neck injury. Rule out drug toxicity. Rule out internal damage from another source. Only after every other explanation has been genuinely eliminated does drowning earn its place on a death certificate. Here's why that matters so directly in this case. Within days of Nolan going missing, before any autopsy had been performed, before any pathologist had touched the body, Jackson County's sheriff made a public statement to reporters that no foul play was involved. At that point in the timeline, that conclusion had not been earned. It could not have been. The process that's supposed to come first, ruling everything else out, had not yet taken place. To be fair, something observed at the scene may have shaped that statement. Field observations aren't meaningless, but an observation made at a scene is not a documented, peer-reviewed finding. It's not something an outside expert can evaluate or verify, and a statement made on camera by a sheriff carries enormous public weight, whether or not the science to support it actually exists yet. Once officials declare accident, that framing follows a case everywhere it goes. It shapes how aggressively evidence gets pursued. It shapes how the public receives every new detail that surfaces later. The proper sequence is examine first, conclude second. In this case, that order was publicly reversed within days of the body being found. And once that reversal happens, it is genuinely difficult to undo. Nolan's family did not accept that reversed sequence quietly, but they also didn't respond with outrage staged for cameras. They responded by hiring their own independent forensic pathologist and bringing in attorney Ben Crump. An independent autopsy was carried out on July 10th, days after Nolan's body was recovered, giving a separate examiner the opportunity to test the official version directly against the physical evidence. But a second autopsy is never a clean restart. And this is the part that rarely gets said with enough honesty. By the time it happens, time has already done damage. In forensic science, time destroys information. It does not preserve it. A body is a kind of physical record, but it's a record that degrades with every passing hour. Nolan's body had already spent days submerged in water before it was recovered. It then went through the state's own initial autopsy. Only after all of that did the independent examiner get access. Refrigeration slows decomposition. It does not stop it. The second pathologist was, in effect, reading a document that had already been left out in the elements. The result of that independent examination was not accident. It was not homicide either. It was something more precise and, frankly, more honest. The finding was undetermined. That word gets misread constantly, so let's be exact about what it actually means. Undetermined does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean the family's concerns are unfounded. It means the available evidence was not sufficient to close the door on any single explanation. One side delivered a fast, confident answer within days. The other side, looking far more carefully at the same situation, admitted it could not be certain at all. That is not two experts disagreeing over interpretation. That is a trained professional declining to overstate what the evidence actually supports. Now, here's where Dr. Judy Melinek actually enters this case. And precision matters here because she has been mischaracterized online more than almost anyone else connected to this story. Pulled in one direction by people who want her to confirm a cover-up. Pulled in the other by people who want her to shut the entire conversation down. Neither version reflects who she actually is on the record. Dr. Melinek is a board-certified forensic pathologist with no connection to either side of this case. She was not hired by the family. She is not working for the state. She is an independent, credentialed voice reviewing what is publicly available with the same professional framework anyone with her training and experience would apply. One of the loudest theories circulating online involves the absence of certain neck structures from Nolan's body when it reached the second pathologist. That absence has been treated by many people as proof on its own that something is being hidden. Dr. Melanek's actual position is the opposite. Retaining tissue or specific anatomical structures in a high-profile or potentially suspicious death is common, standard forensic practice. A medical examiner might retain those structures simply out of caution, regardless of whether anything unusual was found there. The retention itself, in her professional assessment, is not the scandal that some corners of the internet have made it out to be. That does not mean the missing tissue is unimportant. It matters enormously, just not for the reason most people assume. It matters because the neck is exactly where evidence of strangulation would appear, and without access to it, the second examiner simply could not look. Not because something sinister was done with it, but because that is where the answer would live, if there is one. And right now, no one outside the state's own office has been able to check. The specific finding that has generated the most attention deserves careful treatment, because the details matter far more than the headline version. The second autopsy identified an area of reddish discoloration in the deep soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. No lacerations on the skin above it. No fractures in the skull beneath it. Just discoloration in a body that had already been through days of decomposition and a full first autopsy before the independent examiner ever had access. Dr. Melanek's specific explanation for that discoloration is more precise than simply pointing to decomposition as a general idea. The back of the head is a common location where a support block is placed underneath a body during a standard autopsy procedure. The pressure from that block, sitting under the head during the first examination, is a real, physical, entirely mundane possible source for exactly this kind of tissue discoloration. Not a blow, not strangulation, possibly nothing more than where a body was propped during a routine procedure. In her own assessment, the only way to actually distinguish between that explanation and genuine internal hemorrhage is to examine tissue samples under a microscope, which is precisely what still needs to happen. She has also addressed a question many people have asked without ever receiving a straight answer. Why didn't the first autopsy examine that specific area if it turned out to be significant? Her explanation is straightforward. A pathologist working on a fresher body, without any visible external sign of injury on the skin, often has no reason to dissect a specific internal region if nothing on the surface points them there, especially when other findings in other parts of the body are already pulling their attention. It is not unusual for a second examiner working on a body that has since begun decomposing to look more carefully at areas the first examiner had no particular reason to investigate. That is not proof of something concealed. It is simply how a fresh examination and an examination conducted days later can reasonably diverge. There is one more element of Dr. Melanek's position that deserves serious weight because it corrects a claim that has spread with total confidence in nearly every corner of this story. On the toxicology question specifically, she has been clear that any result tied to alcohol levels must be interpreted with decomposition factored in. Bacteria present in a decomposing body can produce alcohol entirely on their own, entirely separate from anything the person drank while alive. In bodies that have undergone significant decomposition, that internally generated alcohol can reach levels high enough to cross a legal threshold based purely on bacterial activity, not behavior. Given how many days Nolan's body spent in warm water before recovery, any toxicology reading connected to alcohol needs to be read with that context in place, not treated as straightforward proof of intoxication. Anyone presenting a raw number as settled evidence without accounting for that factor is working with an incomplete picture, regardless of which direction they are trying to push the story. And perhaps the most important thing she has said in this entire case is the part that almost never makes it into a headline because it does not confirm anyone's preferred theory. When asked directly whether this case ultimately comes down to the toxicology report, her answer was no. A single lab result does not resolve a case like this. It is one piece of a much larger picture. What actually determines whether this ends up ruled an accident or something else is the investigation itself. The scene, the surrounding circumstances, whether Nolan was truly alone in his final minutes or whether someone else was present with him, that is where this case will be decided, not in a laboratory, in the facts investigators either do or do not pin down about those final moments. Different causes of death leave evidence in different locations. When the question involves manual strangulation specifically, the evidence concentrates almost entirely in the front of the neck, not the back. The back of the neck is mostly muscle and spine. The front is where the airway sits, where the major blood vessels run, and where the physical signs of applied pressure would actually appear, if they exist at all. That region is what forensic pathologists refer to as the neck block. And it is exactly the region that was retained by the state and never released with the rest of Nolan's body when it was transferred to the second examiner. There are 3 specific things a forensic examiner looks for when strangulation is a possibility worth evaluating. The first is the hyoid bone, a small, delicate horseshoe-shaped structure that sits high in the front of the throat. Unlike most bones in the body, it is largely unprotected, held in place by muscle, rather than connected to the surrounding skeleton in the way most bones are. In some cases of manual strangulation, it can fracture under pressure. Its condition, intact or broken, is one of the clearest physical signals available. The second is the strap muscles, thin muscles running down the front of the neck just beneath the skin. Under compression, tiny blood vessels within them can rupture internally, leaving signs visible to a trained examiner even when nothing appears on the surface. The third is petechiae, pinpoint hemorrhages that form when small blood vessels burst from sustained pressure. They are often found in the eyes, the face, or the lining of the heart. None of these 3 signs proves anything conclusively on its own. Together, they form a recognizable pattern, and pattern recognition is the actual foundation of how forensic pathology works. All 3 of those indicators are located in exactly the region that was retained and never handed over, which means, as things currently stand, no independent expert has been able to confirm or rule out any of them. That is not an abstract concern. That is a specific gap in the examination record. To be fair about the state's position, retaining tissue during an active investigation is not automatically suspicious. Medical examiners do this regularly, sometimes to preserve material for further testing, sometimes specifically because something was found and they want to hold it as evidence. On its own, retention does not prove wrongdoing. But here is why normal procedure does not fully settle the question. If the state retained that tissue, the state also examined that tissue. Whatever they found is documented somewhere in the first autopsy report, a report the public still has not seen. The retention itself may be procedurally routine. The extended silence sitting on top of it is what deserves scrutiny. There is also a second complication that is straightforward on paper, but genuinely misleading if you do not know to account for it. A number on a toxicology report looks objective. In a case like this, it is not automatically so. Decomposition can generate its own alcohol, entirely separate from anything Nolan consumed. In bodies that have undergone significant decomposition, that internally generated alcohol can climb high enough to cross legal thresholds, based purely on bacterial activity. Given how many days Nolan's body spent in water before recovery, any reading connected to alcohol must be interpreted with that biology factored in, not taken at face value. Anyone treating a raw number as proof of intoxication without that context is working with a fundamentally incomplete picture, regardless of which direction they are pointing the story. Here is where this case moved in a way that connects directly to what has been in dispute from the beginning. At the National Urban League Convention, standing alongside Nolan's parents, Ben Crump announced that his team has retained professional audio engineering experts to conduct a formal review of the original emergency call in its entirety. Not a clip, not a 15-second excerpt. The complete recording, reviewed forensically and professionally. For weeks, every version of what is or is not audible in that recording has come from someone outside any formal process. A content creator running it through software, an audio professional posting an independent pass on social media. Commentators arguing over what they personally believe they hear. None of it authenticated. None of it conducted by someone with the training, the tools, and the direct professional engagement with this specific case that a formally retained expert would bring. That changes now. This is the first time a review of that audio is being conducted by professionals directly engaged by the family's legal team, with the credibility and resources to potentially settle, with genuine authority, what is and is not actually present on that recording. Crump also announced something else at the same event that has not received nearly enough attention. His team has brought in oceanic engineering experts to examine the tidal conditions in the area where Nolan's body was found. The tension he raised is direct and difficult to dismiss on its face. Nolan's body was reportedly recovered in essentially the same location where his friends say they last saw him. Crump's question is straightforward. How is that possible when accounting for actual tidal movement in that stretch of water over 2 full days? Low tide, high tide, current, drift. All of that movement should, in theory, have displaced a body significantly over that span. Crump stated publicly that the math, as it has been presented so far, does not hold up. Full fairness requires acknowledging what we do not yet know. These findings were just announced. The review has not yet been completed. It is entirely possible there is a current-based explanation for why a body might remain closer to its point of entry than people assume, depending on depth, wind, and the precise location in the water. It is also entirely possible that Crump is correct, and that this specific detail does not survive careful scrutiny. What changed is that this is now a formally examined question rather than a suspicion circulating online, and that distinction matters significantly for where this case goes next. There is a sentence from Dr. Roger Mitchell that deserves far more attention than it has received because it reframes the central question this case is actually trying to answer. Saying Nolan drowned, in Dr. Mitchell's own words, does not tell you what happened to him. Drowning can be the honest, technically accurate cause of death, and still leave the most important questions completely open. Was he conscious when he entered the water, or unconscious? Was he forced in, or did he go in on his own? Those questions are not answered by a cause of death finding. They are answered by everything surrounding it. And right now, everything surrounding it remains incomplete. That incompleteness is specific, not abstract. Ben Crump laid out exactly what is still missing. His team is actively working to coordinate with Dr. Mitchell to finally obtain access to the throat structures retained by the state and never released with the body. Alongside that, they are seeking access for Dr. Mitchell to the photographs and observations recorded by the state medical examiner's office at the moment Nolan was first discovered. By the time Dr. Mitchell examined the body on July 10th, the airway and the lungs had already been dissected during the state's initial autopsy. Without them, Dr. Mitchell could not determine whether water was present in the lungs at all, which is one of the most basic physical indicators of whether someone drowned versus died from another cause before entering the water. A board-certified forensic pathologist, the president of the National Medical Association, examined Nolan's body without access to the lungs, the airway, or the throat. Whether that reflects standard sequencing when 2 autopsies are conducted, or something more problematic, is a question that has not been answered to anyone's satisfaction. What is being sought now is worth being precise about, because precision is the only thing that keeps a story like this honest. Nobody is asking the state to hand over evidence and step away from the process. What is being pursued is access. Dr. Mitchell being allowed to examine what the state already holds, so that an independent, credentialed expert can finally evaluate the exact tissue capable of confirming or ruling out strangulation, rather than that determination existing solely within one office's private files. To be fair to the state's position, controlling access to physical evidence during an active investigation is often exactly what a responsible prosecutor's office is supposed to do. Protecting the integrity of a potential grand jury proceeding, potential charges, or a future trial is a legitimate reason to manage who handles evidence and when. Both of those realities can coexist. The retention can be procedurally appropriate, and the family can still have every legitimate reason to push hard for their own expert to finally conduct a real examination. Neither side is automatically wrong. That is precisely why this remains an open, contested question rather than a settled one. At the same press conference, attorney Eric Herz, part of the family's legal team, provided an update that significantly widens the scope of what is being investigated. According to Herz, the district attorney's office has responded in writing, expressing willingness to consider evidence gathered by the family's team, though the specifics of what gets shared in each direction are still being worked out. More importantly, both sides have reached what he described as a tentative agreement to move forward with a joint investigation of multiple phones, not only devices belonging to the family's clients, but other phones connected to this case as well. This is worth slowing down on. This entire case has been publicly framed around Nolan's phone specifically. What was or was not deleted from it, why it appeared the way it did when his family received it back. If multiple phones are now part of a coordinated joint investigation, that means investigators are not only asking what happened to Nolan's device, they are asking what exists on other devices belonging to people who were present that day, on the boat, on the island. That is a meaningfully broader scope than anything publicly confirmed before this announcement. Hertz also confirmed that the FBI is expected to be present for this joint phone review, which is consistent with what has already been separately established. The Bureau functioning as a supporting resource for the local investigation, bringing federal forensic capabilities to a specific examination that neither side could conduct as thoroughly alone. According to Hertz, that review is expected to surface information that no party involved in this case has been able to access yet. To be honest about the limits of what we know, a tentative agreement is not the same as something already underway. A letter expressing willingness to consider evidence is not the same as evidence actually changing hands. Everything Hertz described is a meaningful step forward. It is a step, not an arrival. The actual joint examination, if and when it takes place, is what will begin answering questions this case has been sitting on for weeks. Near the end of the press conference, a reporter asked Crump directly about a reported threat to sue him and Nolan's own family for defamation. His response was fast and pointed. He called it a distraction, said it was not slowing his team down in any way, and made clear that the family's focus was entirely on reaching the truth, not on responding to legal threats designed to quiet them. When pressed further, he declined to give the accusation additional airtime, saying plainly that it did not deserve a response and that he was not going to spend energy engaging with people attempting to redirect attention away from 3 young men dead under suspicious circumstances. This deserves to be taken seriously regardless of where you stand on the underlying case. A threat to sue a grieving family for defamation over statements made publicly while they are actively searching for answers about their own son's death is not a small thing to float and not a small thing to dismiss. If that threat is real and moves forward, it becomes a separate legal conflict layered directly on top of everything this family is already carrying. If it was never intended to go forward and existed only as pressure, that carries its own serious implications. A defamation threat deployed against grieving parents without genuine legal intention behind it functions as intimidation, not as a claim. Crump also addressed a question raised at the event about his own financial stake in cases like this. He responded that he is a lawyer like any other lawyer, and that he should be compensated for his work the same way any attorney would be, drawing a direct comparison to how no one questions whether a corporate defense attorney or an insurance lawyer gets paid. That point stands on its own terms. It is also fair for people following this case to want transparency about how these cases are funded, who is paying for what, and where publicly raised money actually goes. Both things can be true simultaneously. And neither one, by itself, tells you anything about whether the underlying case has merit. Understanding the setting of everything covered here matters, because it shapes how all of it should be read. This was not a standalone press conference focused solely on Nolan Wells. It took place at the National Urban League's National Convention, and Crump did not come alone. He brought the families of 2 other young black men whose deaths within roughly the same 3-month window followed patterns his legal team has described as strikingly similar. Among them, Daniel Irvin's case out of Texas, which has been covered in prior reporting, and a newer case from Lexington, Kentucky, involving an 18-year-old named Tyler Smith. The Tyler Smith case is being addressed briefly here for a specific reason. The first-hand accounts and reporting that have surfaced so far are less consistent and less verified than what exists on Nolan's case or Daniel Irvin's. Building out details that cannot be confirmed cleanly about people who cannot be confidently identified from available sourcing would not serve the story or the people at its center. What can be said at the level of actual confidence is this. According to statements made publicly in Nashville, Tyler Smith died on the same 4th of July weekend as Nolan, the only black person present at a small gathering, from what was initially described to his family as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His family has publicly disputed key elements of that account. The case has reportedly moved slowly since. The reason Crump brought 3 families together in the same room matters beyond any single individual case. His argument, stated directly from the podium, is that all 3 situations share a recognizable shape. A young black man dies under circumstances that do not initially draw the level of scrutiny the evidence warrants. An early institutional response closes the door faster than the facts support, and a family is left fighting on its own to force a real investigation open. Whether that shared shape reflects something structural in how certain deaths are investigated, or whether these are 3 separate tragedies that happen to share surface similarities, is exactly the question this entire event was built to place in front of the public. And it is not a question either side of this conversation gets to answer alone. Whatever anyone believes about any individual piece of evidence in Nolan's case specifically, 3 families sat in the same room because each of them has lost a son under circumstances that have not been fully explained to their satisfaction. That is not a detail to argue past. That is the center of everything.